You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Welcome to this episode of the Business of Practice podcast, where we focus on the business and human sides of equine veterinary medicine. In this episode, we're going to talk with Dr. Martha Mallicote about the importance of budgets, both personally and for practices. I'm your host, Dr. Amy Grice, business consultant and former equine practice owner. The Business of Practice podcast is brought to you in 2024 by CareCredit. Dr. Mallicote is a Weeks Endowed Clinical Associate Professor at the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine in the Large Animal Clinical Sciences Department. The Weeks Endowed Professorship is appointed to a faculty member who demonstrates exemplary success as an innovator and a scholar in teaching, and who is a role model for collaboration, teamwork, and faculty citizenship as a mentor and educational leader. Dr. Mallicote teaches veterinary students in the classroom, the large animal hospital, and in the veterinary business curriculum. She is the director of the Veterinary Business Certificate Program for DVM students, a program that's grown to include almost a quarter of the DVM cohort, which prepares them to own and operate their own veterinary practices. Dr. Mallicote earned her Bachelor of Science in the year 2000 at the College of Charleston School of Business and Economics, and in 2006 she graduated with her DVM from the University of Tennessee College of Veterinary Medicine. After an internship, she completed a residency at the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine and became a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine in 2012. In 2019, she completed her Master's of Business Administration at the University of Florida. You are a special veterinarian, and we're so happy to have you here today. Welcome, Dr. Mallicote.
Well, I appreciate your kind words. I think that's perhaps a bit effusive, but nonetheless appreciated. And I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's, I know how much you relish talking about budgets, and it's a rare person who loves thinking about a budget, but you're passionate about them. Can you tell us how that came about?
It's a great question, Amy. And I think, honestly, the idea is that having a budget and being aware of a budget is about information. And I find that, certainly when I'm working with and teaching students and new graduates, sometimes there is a tendency towards lack of information, towards not knowing, because then you don't know how things actually are. And so to me, the benefit of proactively thinking about and having a budget, whether it be a personal budget, a practice budget for your nascent startup or for your large existing practice, is that you know what's going on and you can make the best decisions based on that instead of having to be very conservative and assume the worst, but not actually know. So I think that's really why I find it to be so important.
Yeah, or even throw caution to the wind and say, maybe it'll come and bite me later, but I'm just going to do it because I want to. And then you're like, oh my God, what has happened?
Absolutely. Also a dangerous maneuver for sure.
Yes, very much. Or you don't want to think about it because it could look really, really scary. And I think that happens to students with debt too.
Absolutely. You have hit the nail on the head because when you start talking about a budget for your household, then you have to start also thinking about what your debt repayment will look like. And those two things go hand in hand in terms of being a source of a lot of stress. So it's better just not to know.
Yep. Drink another beer. Don't know.
Exactly.
So if you are thinking about those personal budgets, which with your students, I bet there's a lot of talk about, okay, what's it going to look like when we get out of school? What is the process? What's the process you go through?
There's a few different approaches, and I think it's incredibly important to set yourself up for success in terms of an approach that you will actually utilize. You can be extremely detailed with a budget. You can be very simple with a budget and use large buckets. And both of those things will be successful if it's something that you will continue to use and to use to guide your decision making. So when we think of budget strategies, there's several things that are pretty common in terms of the general, world of discussion of budgeting. One of the most common things you'll hear of is a 50-30-20 budget. 50% of your income should go towards necessities, 30% should go towards wants or desired things that aren't required, and 20% should go towards some sort of savings, both retirement and maybe some other savings buckets. And that's a pretty simple way to break it down. I kind of call that the middle ground budget, because you do still have to think about what's in each of those categories and what are the numbers, and proactively look at them through the whole, month or, quarter, or however you're looking at those numbers. The most detail-oriented fashion of doing this, which is probably not the population of people that we're convincing to do a budget, they probably already have one, is to literally line item every single thing in your budget and consider each one and whether it's necessary and how can I cut it. And it's really kind of a person who's super detail oriented and might lean towards almost micromanaging, but maybe that makes them feel more comfortable about their money. And that's totally an appropriate option. So we kind of think of that as line item budgeting. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum is something that's much more simple, but still ensures that you are saving and you're meeting your required options. And that's sort of a pay yourself first model, where the first things you do out of your income in whatever period you're measuring it, whether it be a month or quarter or whatever, is you pay your debts, you pay your required expenses, and you pay your savings. And ideally, you do those things automatically. And then everything that's left, you can play with and you can spend as you want. And so it sort of automates as much as possible there and doesn't require that you micromanage those numbers through the course of the month.
Do you find that people use a spreadsheet or something like You Need a Budget?
Absolutely, the apps. Yes. Perhaps because veterinarians tend, not all of us, but we tend towards being a little bit more of the numerically organized type of folks. Lots of spreadsheets are common. Apps can be fantastic as a means of keeping up with the numbers and making it really easy. It's right on your phone. You Need a Budget, or YNAB, as it's commonly called, is an excellent program. There was an excellent program that was out there called Mint that has just recently gone away, unfortunately. And I have yet to find another free app that I'm really comfortable with. The thing to be cautious about with a free budgeting app is if you're not paying for the product, you might be the product. And so although YNAB costs a little bit of money, you can feel pretty comfortable about your financial information staying secure in there and not being used for any other purposes. So
that's really helpful for people to know. Yeah.
The Business of Practice podcast is brought to you by CareCredit. CareCredit keeps equine veterinarians at the heart of care by providing horse owners with simple, budget-friendly financing options. By helping to bridge the gap between cost and care, CareCredit supports healthy financial relationships between veterinarians and their clients. Clients have a flexible way to pay over time for all types of care, and practices get paid in 2 business days. It's a payment experience everyone can feel good about.
So that's a personal budget. What about a practice budget? Sometimes people, can use last year's P&L on QuickBooks and just generate something. What are the nuances? And do you like a monthly budget, a quarterly budget? How do you like people to do it?
So a little bit of the answer to that still goes back to this idea of what kind of budgeter will you be? I can envision a situation with a smaller practice with perhaps less money coming in and out, where that individual maybe doesn't have as much time to micromanage things, where they might look at it a little less frequently. But also, if you're not dealing with a ton of money, you might be right at the margin more often and have, cash flow concerns. And so, in theory, as long as you are up to date, at least on your cash flow, you could look at your actual budgeting numbers a little less frequently. But I think for a practice, because it is not just you and your household, it's potentially employees, other business expenses, trying to do a monthly budget is probably the best strategy, and making sure that you really allot time to be looking at that and be looking at your cash flow. It's all the same psychological nuance of your personal budget, right? If you don't look at it, it's not a problem, but it can become a problem not only for you, but also for your business and your employees.
Absolutely. And sometimes people don't have good cash flow in the slower months of their year. And if they have not thought about, okay, but there's some things that we pay only once a year and they come due during
those slow months.
right? Making a
Absolutely.
plan.
Yes, absolutely. So when you're doing those proactive, taking last year's P&L and making a plan for the coming year, it's important to look at the whole year, but it is also important to look at those month to month variations you might see, because you're exactly right. And a great example of this is if you pay for your practice malpractice insurance once a year,
Yes.
it is due at the end of December, right? When your equine practice is the slowest it can be.
Right.
And so it's a great example of trying to be cognizant of when things are due and what your cash flow looks like, and not just the revenue and expenses, because that's not the whole
Mhm.
picture.
Right. It's not at all. So once you've made the budget, talk us through how to really practically use it.
It is important to then take that information about what you expect to be happening and compare it regularly with what's actually happening. In a personal budgeting realm, that works really well in the apps, because you can categorize everything and you can compare it to where you should be in those different buckets. For a practice, that might mean, on a monthly basis, not only looking at where you are year to date, but actually looking at by month, what did you expect for each month for revenue and expenses? Unfortunately, equine practice is a lot like some of our seasonal Florida small animal practices too, that have snowbird capacity, right? And that's very different than most average small animal practices that have reliable revenue all year round. Equine practice has a very clear high season and low season, and that's not actually that different from a lot of areas where they have many tourists and not year-round residents. So there are models for this that are beyond just equine practice, but it's really important to be cognizant of those month-to-month changes that you expect, because you can't just take your number for the year and divide it by 12 at all. And you can use that last year data to help inform what your next year data should be.
So with QuickBooks, when you bring over like a month to create a budget, would you suggest that people actually look at the budget to actual?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I think the reporting where it looks at what you anticipated or budgeted to the actual data on a monthly and a yearly basis is really helpful. And I have actually set up some folks, and I find to be really helpful, you can automate all of that in QuickBooks. And if you have an accountant, they should be doing this for you too, right? I can automate in QuickBooks to email me at the end of every month that report. And when I tell folks that don't know this, I think it's a little bit of they maybe didn't want to know, but if you get that report pushed to your email once a month, it forces you to pay attention to it right away. And so go ahead and set up your automated reporting of a, monthly budget update, and looking at your revenue generation, even looking at revenue generation week by week in that month, and compare it to last year. So you can see how are we looking in the short run. That doesn't mean you panic and make a panicky decision based on that short run data, but you're staying up to date on how it's going so far so that you can adjust if necessary.
I think it's so important. And what you said about not panicking, I think whenever I ask groups who are starting to put out messages on our, say, Decade One Facebook pages, and they're like, is anybody else have their revenue dropping this month or this week or whatever? And it's like, yeah, it's just, and everybody's like, yeah, that's happening to me too. And I'm like, yeah, I remember doing that for 25 years. It gets a little,
but it's
slow.
August and it's okay.
It's like, or it's December, and
Correct.
You're like, oh my God, we're going out of business. And you do it every December for 25 years.
Absolutely. No, you're
Right.
completely right about that. No, don't panic. But you can use that data to inform a little bit of decision making, right? If we think of a quarter of practice expenses being cost of goods sold or supplies, if you are seeing revenue slow down, maybe you don't aggressively reorder your supplies. Maybe you're switching over to a time of year that you need to have less on the shelf. Some practices even have different inventory plans for busy season versus not busy season. So you can make small adjustments based on that aren't panic, but maybe a little bit of ways to improve your cash flow as that revenue might be trending down with the season as you expected it to.
Right. And the other thing I would say is that as you see that happening and you compare it to last year, and you're like, yeah, I guess this happened last year too.
Absolutely.
Enjoy the fact that your head's not in a vice. Try to take a deep breath and say, everything's okay. This is the typical seasonality. We're going to be fine. And try to read a book.
Yes.
Go visit a friend.
You get that time off that you were wishing for a few months ago.
Right.
And having the information in front of you can make you feel comfortable with that fact.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a great way to why you want to make a budget.
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
What else should our listeners know about budget? What else would you like to share?
I think I would just encourage you to take that first step. I think for many people, they'd rather not know. So take that first step. And even if that doesn't mean that by next week, you're going to have an extremely complicated month and year to date budget in your QuickBooks setup. I have spoken to many new practice owners, and you can really start an equine practice on a shoestring with not a ton of cash flow. And so you just kind of do it all yourself. And so there's steps there, right? There's let's start categorizing our expenses correctly and perhaps use a chart of accounts that's a veterinary industry one. Get that in line. And then you can start critically looking at maybe one or two categories in there. So don't feel like you have to bite off the whole big chunk at one time. Get a little bit better data and a little bit better data. And eventually you're going to be doing a fantastic job of managing your practice without feeling like it's an overwhelming mountain to climb.
That's excellent advice. Really excellent advice. I hope that our listeners will make a budget or start just taking that first step, because it really, that having information, like you started our conversation, having information matters. I mean, we make decisions as problem solvers by gathering information and then making a decision. And the same is true for your money.
Absolutely. And there's a ton of resources available, honestly. For personal budgeting, that's certainly not something that's veterinary specific, right? You can go out onto the web and look at personal finance websites and get all sorts of templates and ideas for how to do this. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's all out there. And when it comes to veterinary accounting, I think a lot of accountants, practice owners start out with an accountant that is someone they know, they're familiar with. They may be local. They may be less familiar with veterinary practice. But there's even resources for how to do this that are available within our practice groups, right? Within AAP or within like practitioner groups that you might be a part of, like DACVIM or like VMG. And so you can start to use some of those veterinary specific resources little by little. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to do any of these things.
Right. It's very, 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 very true. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mallicote. And thank you all for listening to the Business of Practice podcast. And a really big thanks to our sponsor, CareCredit. And to all my listeners out there, be brave, embrace change, and start a budget.
Absolutely.